Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 134 of The Best Games Period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and with me is the ever wonderful, ever vivacious Naomi Lugo.
Hey, everyone.
And this is The Best Games Period, where every week we talk about a new game that may or may not be one of the best games of all time. And we're super excited to dive into this week's subject. But before we do that, hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. And I'm really trying not to sneeze right now, because that'd be perfect timing. Forgive me, audience. The things we do for quality entertainment.
Yeah, that's how the quote goes from Game of Thrones.
Yep. Yeah, so I've been doing good. I've been playing a lot of Dragon Quest Builders, which is really, really awesome.
What have you been building?
I'm trying to play it. Well, I'm still apparently in the tutorial. It's one of those old school RPG styles where the tutorial is a million years long, and then it opens up to the real game, but you're still playing. So I'm still in that area. So I'm still working on my first farm base thing, and then after the tutorial, which is basically doing all the quests in this beginning area, you get like your own island, and you can get moving from there. Yeah, so I'm trying to charge through it so I can, like, do legit building.
Is it as adorable as the first one?
I never played the first one, but it's pretty dang adorable.
You were also telling me before the show that it gets kind of real.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so one of the first... I mean, and this is, I guess, not really spoilery, but... So, your ship wrecks, and that's, like, the, like, first fake tutorial, and then you land on this island... And there's a bunch of bodies laying around on the beach. And they're all in this really cute chibi style. So I go up to them, like, thinking, like, hey, I'll just shake them awake and we're gonna go build together. And instead, there's, like, a text prompt and it says you push the body, but nothing happens or something like that.
No.
And then it just fades away and disappears. And there's, like, 6 bodies. So, yeah, it gets a little real.
Okay. Yeah, that's the starting point, too.
Yes. So, it's not as light and adorable as it looks. I mean, it still is, but it definitely gets a little dark.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You doing okay with all that?
Yes. What, you mean my, like, emotional state?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just taking it one day at a time and trying to keep my villagers alive, you know? But yeah, I'm trying to play it before I start Fire Emblem, because I know that's another game that's gonna suck all my time away. Yeah, and I know you're gonna be playing it rather soon, for some reason.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I couldn't find the pre-order for Fire Emblem, and so I asked you what to do about it right before the show. And you encouraged me to buy it digitally, and so I did. And right after that, I managed to find the order that I put in for the, like, Seasons, I think it's just called the Season of War Special Edition Fire Emblem, that's going to be coming in a couple... it's going to be coming next week, so I guess, like, next Friday, Thursday or Friday. But that's still a long time away, so at least I guess this way I can play it now early. But also I've bought Fire Emblem twice. Thank you, Naomi.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for. Support. Yeah. But hey,
are you gonna support me enough to send me $60?
Maybe.
Please back our Patreon so I can use your money to buy games.
Can afford dual copies of games. I wouldn't want to wait a week though. That's crazy. It's a long time.
I don't know. It's
especially
supposed to be a pretty
pre-order.
Good bundle.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway, so is that all you've been playing?
I've been playing The Sims, if that counts. I've built so many buildings now. So that's been like my background thing. But I think that's it. And then mobile games here and there.
I gotcha.
How about you?
So I've been playing a fair bit of Final Fantasy, as always. And I also, over the past week, I sat down and in one gameplay session, I knocked out the entirety of Battle Chef Brigade, which is a delightful game. And also, I'm really sorry I'm choking up for some reason. My voice is going to sound weird on this podcast. I'm sorry. But Battle Chef Brigade is really, really cute, and we have a guest lined up who actually wants to talk about it. So hopefully we will get to that in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks adorable, so I'm down for that.
Yeah, it took me about 9 hours to finish. I probably could have finished it in about 8. I definitely have some criticisms, but it is very, very good. That's all I'll say for now.
Okay. Very, very good.
Yeah, it's very charming. It's very charming.
I'm excited. Okay.
I think you'll dig it.
I think I will too. I like foodstuffs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's anime plus food. Mm-hmm.
And it's a match 3 game, which like you do mobile games all the time. That should be right up your alley.
Yes, indeed.
Let's see. And I think I might have talked about this last week, but you weren't here. There's a free-to-play game on Steam called Shrinking Pains, which is about eating disorders and mental health. And it's very, very good. And I'll just say that again, so that if people didn't listen to the last episode, they can hear it again on this one.
So what format is it?
It's basically like a text adventure.
Okay.
Not a text adventure, like a typical visual novel kind of style.
Okay.
There are a couple choices you can make throughout the game, but they don't hugely impact the course of events. So, yeah, it takes about 20 minutes to complete.
Okay.
It's
and what was the name of it one more time for our dear listeners?
And you, Shrinking Pains.
Shrinking Pains. Okay, cool. Shout out to Shrinking Pains.
Heck yeah.
What game are we talking about this week?
This week we're talking about not just one game. We're talking about maybe more the framework of countless games. This week we are talking about Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Mm-hmm. Give us your best dragon noise.
Oh god. Baby dragon.
That was really cute, actually.
My voice is not ready to be a dragon.
No, your first attempt was very good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, the game created by Gary Gygax back in the early to mid 70s, and has since seen many different incarnations about one or two every decade. And right now we are currently on the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. People who have listened to the Best Games period quite avidly might be familiar with our Dragon Guard sub show, which is a Dungeons and Dragons program. We play that game using Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And I also produce a different podcast called We Wanted Adventurers, which is also a Dungeons and Dragons show. And there are many, many others all over the internets. Shout out to the Adventure Zone. And yeah, this is a tabletop role-playing game. One of the granddaddies of all tabletop role-playing games. And it's pretty cool. In fact, the entire reason that we even started playing Dragon Guard at all was so that we could eventually have this discussion about the game and, its history and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Because this noob right here had never played it before.
Right. And, I had played a decent amount, but now, obviously, I've played a lot more, and I feel like I'm in a little bit better spot to talk about it now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So question for the noobs, and I've always wondered this. What goes into the different editions? Like, what new content do we see? Like, is it like video games where we get like updates and new versions, or is it like a complete overhaul?
So it's a little bit of both. So I think what's important to understand is that Dungeons and Dragons grew out of the wargaming community. So you know how people like reenact like the Civil War and like these different great battles of history?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that all kind of started like that has a very long history. But that kind of reenactment grew into instead of using actors to reenact the battle, you would use miniatures, and like people would take on the roles of like the generals and ordering troops around and recreating these famous battles. And like that evolved into this huge industry, like a very, very niche industry, mind you, of people showing up at conventions and basically marshaling their miniature forces and like having these long drawn out sessions of like painstakingly recreating these battles from history. And Gary Gygax kind of came out of that and was like, hey, what if we use a similar framework for these reenactments where they had a bunch of these rules that are very similar to what D&D is today? You know, these rules for how combat works and all of that. What if we applied that to like a more narrative and like a smaller scope almost? Like instead of, you know, having a bunch of old nerds standing around discussing like battle tactics, what if instead the focus was on an adventure and like a narrative? And so he began putting together this game that would eventually become Dungeons and Dragons. And that's what resulted in I believe the 1977 Dungeons and Dragons first. It wasn't even called first edition. It was just like this red box that said Dungeons and Dragons. I think there might have even been a predecessor to that, which was just like a white paper version of Dungeons and Dragons. But then the second version. So the first version came out in like 1977. The second version came out in 1981. Sorry. Second edition came out in 1989. To answer your question, basically the first version of Dungeons and Dragons that came out didn't have a bunch of rules for a lot of things. In fact, part of what buying Dungeons and Dragons said in the rulebook is basically, hey, there's this other game if you want to like travel to places over land, and it has really good rules for that. So just buy that other game and play Dungeons and Dragons, and then if you need to go anywhere, use that game. And
okay.
I forget what it was called. It was like Wilderness Survival or like Wildland Survival, something like that.
Kind of like a DLC.
Almost, but it was unrelated to anything that Gary Gygax had put together. And basically the game evolved with each subsequent expansion to include more rules for monsters, more standalone expansions or adventures that people could go on, all of that. And then when a new edition comes out, it is basically a full revamp of the rules. And so it especially with second edition, because most people don't go back and play first edition Dungeons and Dragons anymore, just because the rules are kind of janky. But there are still a lot of people who really love second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and that's because the designers went back to the drawing board and from the ground up redesigned the entire game for this kind of unified purpose.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that was that the rules became very convoluted and very intricate, and that's partly what led to the game having its reputation, which persists to this day, that it's mainly oriented towards nerds. And like is inaccessible to anyone who isn't a super nerdy type. But then 3rd edition came out, and 3rd edition was kind of another redesign of all the rules. And I think 3rd edition is also when Wizards of the Coast, the company that now produces Dungeons & Dragons, kind of realized that there is this good business model in coming out with new editions. Because when you come out with a new edition, that leaves everyone who has gone through like all the pre-made adventures and all the official content, that leaves them hungry for more. And so the new version comes out, they have to learn that. It allows them to tweak a bunch of these different rules that may or may not have been like, thorns in the community's side or whatever. And it also allows them to sell a lot more of these new adventures and expansions and all of that. And so that's kind of what we've seen lately. Like, D&D 3rd edition came out in 2000. It got a revamp into 3.5 in 2003. And then in 2008, 4th edition came out because Wizards of the Coast essentially like tried to ultra simplify the rules of Dungeons and Dragons to kind of appeal to the MMO crowd, to be honest, like the World of Warcraft folks.
Okay.
And then in 2014, they came out with 5th edition. So basically, if you consider that the first one came out, like the first official version came out in 1977, it took them 12 years to come out with the 2nd edition.
Okay.
From 2nd edition to 3rd edition, it was 11 years. From 3rd edition to 4th edition, it was 8 years. And then from 4th edition to 5th edition, it was 6 years. So now 5th edition has been out for 5 years. And so far it seems to be the most popular incarnation of the game yet. Especially with the digital integration that it has now in D&D Beyond. And basically, in my opinion, I've played 3.5, 4, and 5. And from what I can gather, 5th edition is like the best version of Dungeons and Dragons to date. Mostly because it takes a lot of the simplified elements from 4th edition and combines some of the weirder and like slightly more complicated interactions from like 3.5. So I guess the answer to your question is basically that it's a combination of reinvention and I guess reinvention and expansion.
Okay.
But also fueled by like capitalist intent, which is like people will get excited when things from like that already existed in like 1st edition D&D or 2nd edition D&D get like put into 5th edition. So for example, for Extra Life, there is a very small module that you can buy, and it adds this unofficial race of creatures called, I think, the Grong or the Grung to D&D 5th edition, and the Grung are basically just frog people.
Okay.
And they already existed in 2nd edition D&D, but because it's a different edition with different rules, Like, they need those, the stats for that race need to be tweaked to fit into 5th edition, and so that leaves a lot of that older content there to be easily mined for modern day money, I guess.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Okay. Yeah, I'd always just wondered if they just kept on building from a base, but it sounds like it's a little less organized than that, but okay, good to know. So what would you say to those people who might close themselves off from playing D&D ever because it is, quote, only for nerds, or, super inaccessible or whatever?
Well, I would say that those people probably haven't tried to play D&D before. Because basically all D&D is improv and joke making with your friends, and you're given the you're given the improv prompt of, you are a heroic adventurer, go. And then bouncing off your friends, and whatever your interpretation of your character is, bouncing off your friends and whatever imaginary characters your DM might come up with for you to bounce off of as well. It's really, really fun. Like, especially if you find a good group of people who are willing to role play and bounce off of you, it's really great. And if you're more into, like, the tactical side of things, if you're into, like, turn-based tactics games, like Fire Emblem, for example, which I now have 2 copies of.
Not my fault at all.
You can also get that, because there are multiple different ways to play the game. The game itself is very flexible. So, for example, the way that we play for Dragon Guard is a type of Dungeons and Dragons that relies on theater of the mind, which is basically where you just share this imaginary space between the entire group, and the DM gets to dictate the rules and, like, the spacing and where everybody is in relation to each other, but then players get to dictate what they do in that imaginary space, and how they react and all of that. And if that's not really your jam, you can take the more tactical approach, and that usually involves miniatures. Now there are these digital tactical spaces that you can play with. Roll20 is a really good example of that, where basically you have a set amount of movement, and you can move a set number of squares in any given direction, based on how fast your character is, and take your actions, and it becomes much more like a turn-based strategy game. So really, it depends on what kind of a game you want to play, who you're playing with, and I would say give it a try, because most people have a certain idea of what Dungeons and Dragons is, or even if they don't have a strong conception of what it is, they just haven't really thought about it. So, like, for example, myself, for the longest time, I did not want to play Dungeons and Dragons, because that's quote-unquote what real nerds do, and I didn't want to, like, cross that line. Like, yeah, I play video games a lot. Yeah, I might write about games. I might have built an entire career about writing about nerd stuff, but I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. So, like, I'm not like a Forsaken nerd.
I'm not that kind of nerd.
Yeah.
Forsaken nerd. That's the name of our next campaign.
No, our current campaign is The Gilded Cage.
The next one.
Oh, okay. Forsaken nerd.
Yes.
Gotcha. Write that down. Mark it.
Okay.
Yeah, what I guess what were your conceptions about D&D before we started playing together?
Honestly, a lot of intimidation, really. Because of that stigma that it's, for nerds, you get this thought that you're not going to understand quick enough and be able to keep up with people. But it's like you said, it really depends on who you play with, because I'm sure if I went into a hardcore D&D group, like, I don't think I would, drown or anything, but it would be a lot harder to keep up, but I think the way that we did it, it was you, me, Kyle, and Marcus in Dragon Guard, and Kyle was a newbie too, and Marcus was like second campaign in or something, so we were all relatively new, and we all just kind of vibed off of the play style that we wanted, and we're all big dorks, and that's how it turned out. So I think there's definitely an intimidation factor in there. I think a lot of people kind of visualize in their mind the more tactical version, even though they might not know the specifics of it, like the miniatures and all that. I think they just see the die and get, intimidated, like, we have
numbers.
To do math. No.
I mean,
really,
there is a little bit of math.
Yeah, but yeah. It's more finding things like stats and whatnot for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, which is interesting to me, is that I think at the heart of a lot of the intimidation is like the fear of getting wrong answers, like it's gonna be some sort of
test,
an
exam,
or like reliving high school again or something. But like, one of the cool and interesting things about D&D is that there aren't really wrong answers. And now, granted, you might
die.
I mean, yeah, you could encounter people who are like, hey, that wasn't the right thing to do, but it's fine to screw up too. Like,
you just stop playing with those people.
Well, like, the thing is, you might not do the most optimal thing in combat. You might not do, quote unquote, the right thing, but people screw up all the time in the real world, and like, it's okay to get it wrong in the game too. Like, that's part of the storytelling, that's part of the fun, and yeah, your character might even die, and that might suck, but one of the cool things about D&D is you can make a new character, and that means you have a whole new range of opportunities for what kind of a character you want to make, what kind of an adventure you want to have. So even death really isn't the end.
Yeah, and I debate that, like, because you're your character, you could even absolve yourself of your decision making. Like, I've definitely done that a couple times where, like, Gnome Suni was kind of an a-hole, It's not necessarily who I am, and she did things that I would never do. But, that's the fun of role-playing. You're being someone else. You're embodying this character. And of course, you can make a character that is just essentially a skin for you to be in this new world in, but you can also just transport yourself into the mind of this person, even if they do suck. And just do what instinctually feels right for them to do. And it's kind of weird, but you totally adapt into this other person.
Yeah, it's a fun way, I think, for everyone to get access to, like, acting and improv, which I think is usually a very big barrier for people, because people consider acting to be like on a stage in front of a bunch of people, or improv being, at that open mic night. But with Dungeons and Dragons, it's very low pressure, because you're in front of 3 or 4 other people who are doing the same thing you're doing. And, like, for example, one of my favorite characters, it gives you an opportunity to be characters and consider courses of action that you never would in, like, your real life, obviously. But, for example, in one of the campaigns where I was playing, I created a character called Silas Duckworth, and Silas was essentially a greedy aristocrat who had dabbled in summoning demons, and one night had summoned a demon without fully knowing what he was doing, and had summoned it incorrectly. and in order to save himself had sacrificed everyone who was in his household in order to keep himself alive, and make a deal with this demon. And as part of that deal, he had to kill an innocent person once every month. And so it essentially put him in the role of like this weird serial killer who is also a greedy and self-absorbed individual, who also didn't necessarily want to be killing people and resented his demon overlord for it. But it was a really unique and interesting situation to deal with. And I guess I dealt with it fairly well because no one in my party realized that the trail of bodies that had been left in our wake was a result of Silas. They just thought he was a greedy aristocrat.
Oh.
And that's really fun and rewarding as like a role player. And some people don't get their enjoyment out of Dungeons and Dragons from that aspect. I certainly do, but other players get much more enjoyment out of like cornering stats and like getting the best stats in like strength, or you know, doing the optimal thing in combat and just rolling through a boss encounter like it ain't no thing.
That is not me.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a flexible game that meets everyone, I think, who comes to it wherever they are. Like, if you're a straight up beginner, totally fine. If you've been playing for 30 years, you're still going to get something new and fun out of it. It's just that flexible.
Okay, so now for a semi-difficult question. You said earlier that it's more than just a game. It's almost like its own category. So for the purpose of this podcast, we come down on one game and we decide if it's one of the best ever. So how do you define Dungeons and Dragons singularly?
Well, what do you mean?
So instead of being this big umbrella with 5 different editions and, you know, different typings, like where you can be tactical or do improv, how do you define the core of Dungeons and Dragons?
Good question.
I want to be difficult, you know?
I guess that I would group it as not even the very first, but like one of the first codified systems of communal storytelling. Like, obviously communal storytelling is something that's been around since like the dawn of time, right? Mm. But there's not really been anything written down. It's usually just a very instinctive thing that we naturally do as human beings, right? You know, gathered around the fire telling ghost stories and interjecting and interrupting each other and, you know, forming a fuller and richer narrative than we could have by ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Dungeons and Dragons is like that, except that it adds in the wrinkle of there being rules, and instead of and mixes it with, I guess, almost stage performance. And there is this, I guess what Dungeons and Dragons does is it gives a concrete backbone and set of rules to and structure to this thing that we have done for, you know, countless ages, and makes it into something different by existing. So like, because we have these rules, it's not just the narrator who says, okay, that does and doesn't happen, right? Instead, there is this set of rules that everyone looks to and agrees upon. And so instead of one person saying yes or no, which, granted, sometimes happens in the case of the DM, a lot of it is left up to chance. A lot of it is left up to just rolling the die and seeing what happens. And there are ways that people influence that chance. There are ways that the DM can influence that chance. But that unknown element is always there. And so that's what I think leads to there being such an element of surprise to Dungeons and Dragons. Because, for example, in Drakengard, I did not predict maybe half the things that happened. And that's being very generous to myself.
We're kind of crazy.
and the finale, I mean, part of the finale led up to you guys actually failing the central quest of Drakengard. And that's not something that I had intended or planned on. And that was really, really interesting to me. That was really cool. And because I hadn't planned on that, the way that that campaign ended was very unexpected for literally everyone involved. And so I think that's really what makes Dungeons and Dragons special, because, like, obviously now there's like a huge range of tabletop role-playing games out there. There's Shadowrun and Exalted and World of Darkness, Vampire the Masquerade, like all of this stuff. And it's all super interesting and really cool and really deep, and they all have these systems, but Dungeons and Dragons was really the thing that pioneered this in popular culture. And I think that the heart of it is this rule system applied to something that we as humans just do naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating to me that applying that rule system changes everything. But if that's really surprising, I think it's interesting that you can then look at a bunch of other human institutions and come to very different conclusions based on, hey, if we apply this very fundamental rule set to something that already exists, we can change it incredibly. Like, it can just become something completely different. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I definitely agree with that, because I think role-playing is just a way for us to let our subconscious out. And I don't mean that like you are really a crazy aristocrat who wants to leave a trail of bodies. No, I think it's like you were exploring this different facet of humanity that you probably wouldn't necessarily get to, right? And exploring how that person interacted with this world and those rules. So it's definitely like a sociology experiment, not experiment, but like just a case of it, where we can act out what we choose to and kind of test ourselves. And I mean, there's so many different facets of that, right? Like, it definitely tells you who you are. Like, if you're that tactics person, who's just like strictly tactics, that says a lot about who you are as a person. If you're more of a goofball like me, and you just want to do improv, that says a lot about me too. So I think it's just an interesting platform to bring out different facets of people. And of course, that's going to leak over into pretty much everything that we've built as society.
Yeah, I've been playing games for a very long time. I have not been playing Dungeons and Dragons for what I would consider a very long time. But there's not a whole lot quite like tabletop role-playing. It is very much this crazy, enigmatic thing that you can't predict or know how it's going to go, But some of the best adventures and best characters that I've encountered in games were characters that came out of tabletop role-playing experiences. And I think that that's something that video games often look to for inspiration. For example, I know, obviously there are a great number of tabletop gaming inspired series like Larian Studios. They're doing Baldur's Gate, which Baldur's Gate is explicitly a Dungeons and Dragons game. There's also like Pillars of Eternity. There's an entire series of Shadowrun RPGs, and really turn-based tactical games come out of the tradition of Dungeons and Dragons.
Would you agree that Dungeons and Dragons formed a skeleton for future games?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Like, whether it's RPGs in general or tactical RPGs, even more specifically, especially in the Western tradition. Maybe not so much influence in Japanese, like console games like Final Fantasy, but definitely in Western RPGs. The influence is undeniably huge. Mm-hmm. But what fascinates me is, despite all of the advancements we've seen in technology and capabilities of designers, there's still something just ineffable and amazing about sitting down with 4 different people. You know, you're having snacks, drinking your Mountain Dew or whatever, your water, and you're able to just collectively conjure up this epic adventure that makes you laugh and cry and care about these characters that are 100% fictional. They only exist in like this weird dream space, and yet we remember them by name for years to come. Mm. And how many games have you played where you don't remember the names of the characters anymore?
80%.
And meanwhile, I remember almost all of the characters that I've ever played. I don't remember all of the characters that they interacted with, but there are definitely some that stand out. And it's just, I don't know, it's really empowering and impactful in a way that is really hard to describe to people who haven't played it before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely got that special kind of magic that you can only get from just your mind. Because you're free of these constraints, right? Like, in the games that you were describing, you just don't get the same effect because there's a set path for you. Or there's these, like, set limitations. Meanwhile, in D&D, we can have fun driving you insane for an hour, talking about how we're going to cross a river, you know? Which on paper sounds dull as hell, but there's just something, I don't know, special and magical come to mind.
Well, and I think part of that is because in your imagination, you get overwhelmed by how many different options you might have to cross that river, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In a video game, there are maybe like 1, 2, 3 options on how to get across the river, right? Mm-hmm. In your imagination, there can be hundreds. And so some people get overwhelmed by all of those possibilities, and that leads to, you know, an hour-long discussion on how to get around a river until you finally just all give up and take the long way around. Mm-hmm. Which also is funny in and of itself. Again, another example of how there aren't any wrong answers, and that's part of what makes it great. You know, just because you didn't figure out how you were going to cross the river doesn't mean you get a game over screen and you have to just start over again. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing about Dungeons and Dragons 2 that I find really interesting. Yeah, sometimes the Dark Lord might win, and, darkness might reign for 1,000 years, but that doesn't mean your campaign has to be over. Maybe your next campaign, after all of the player characters are dead, is playing as the people who overthrow that Dark Lord. Or maybe it's something else. Like, people and heroes continue to exist just because there's a tyrant. So another aspect of it is having consequences that continue on,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be really, really cool.
Yeah. So, best game period?
Absolutely. This is like a slam dunk. Like, this not only does like baseline rules and like maybe baseline characters included with Dungeons and Dragons make for unforgettable adventures, but like people have been playing this game since it came out in the 70s, and it's just fantastic. Like, and I mean that as like both like fantastical and also in terms of quality. Like, it's a undeniably good game. And just because Tom Hanks appeared on a PSA video about the satanic evils of D&D, I think that makes it almost even better.
Okay.
Sorry. Tom Hanks was in a anti-D&D PSA ad.
I had no idea, and that's like extremely hilarious.
Oh, it's one of his very first acting gigs.
Oh, okay.
It was made during the Satanic Panic of the 80s.
Satanic Panic. Oh my god, I love it. So he wasn't necessarily against it himself, but he was in propaganda against it.
No, he was just a kid playing in like, I forget what it's called. I need to actually look this up, otherwise it's gonna really bug me. Yes, he was in a film from 1982 called Mazes and Monsters.
Mazes and Monsters.
Yep.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay.
You can find the trailer on YouTube. It's basically about four D&D players in college who play they play the game and it turns evil or something dumb.
Love it.
Yup.
Their poor fragile little minds. Okay. Well, I mean, I definitely agree that Dungeons and Dragons is like paramount to everything we know in gaming, especially in the Western world, like you said. But I think it's kind of like hard to pin down, right? At least for someone like me who hasn't really seen all the sides of it, or hasn't DM'd, I think you as a DM see a lot more of what's behind the clock face and make all of that move, and I'm just there to be a dork. So I kind of miss out on all of what goes into building a world, but I can appreciate it,
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely agree that it's a best game, but it's like hard to really define it for me.
Yeah, because it does have all of these different aspects to it. On the one hand, it's almost more framework than it is game itself, because it's not giving you a direct story, but each story uses that framework. It's hard to parse, but I guess have you enjoyed playing it? Like,
Yes.
What is your general experience been like, going from a complete newbie to someone who has finished an entire campaign of Dungeons and Dragons?
Oh, I love it. It can be whatever you want. I don't know. It's just like going back and being a kid and like being in the playground and be like, okay, and then you did this, and then I'm gonna attack you now. You know, it's kind of that kind of thing for me.
Okay.
Which is so pure.
What have been some highlights for you?
Like campaign specific or like what do you mean?
Like, I guess maybe like takeaways. Like, I mean, it could be campaign specific, but I guess I was thinking more along the lines of what aspects did you find really fun and fulfilling? Was it like creating your character, or was it playing your character, or was it meeting NPCs? Was it meeting like your allies, or was it the combat, or like which aspects of the game really stood out to you as enjoyable and fun?
Yeah, so it was really interesting to see my character grow. As cliche as that sounds, and like, but it was just a really weird concept to me that this character I created would grow in ways that was out of my control, even though I'm, controlling her. Like the D&D environment is shaping her, but I'm still there. It was really interesting to see that, Granted, she didn't grow very much emotionally, but she grew. I don't know. Nom Suni's a very interesting character. Recommend just going and listening to our shenanigans. But yeah, that was something I really didn't expect. I thought that I would have like complete control, over all of my actions and who she would be and all of that stuff. But no, she just kind of formed into the environment. So that was really interesting in terms of storytelling.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, you go into D&D and you have this idea for what you want to be. And generally, it's a badass, right? You want to be this badass, like, dragon slayer, whatever. So you might come with this completely formed backstory character and, this is what's going to happen. This is what they're going to be. This is what they're going to do. And you might go down a completely different path, And that's just something I wasn't really expecting.
Yeah, and they might grow into something you never intended them to be. Like, going back to Silas Duckworth for a minute, like, my character was intended to be, like, this evil character. And, like, he's the kind of person who's willing to murder other people just to save his own skin. And what ended up happening was, compared to all of my allies, he ended up being the least bloodthirsty person in our entire party, and instead they just all looked at him and saw a normal nobleman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he grew into this character who was, by necessity, evil, but not necessarily enjoying it. Like, I don't know, it was interesting, and I didn't expect that.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear what you're saying. Is there anything we haven't touched on? Dungeons and Dragons is just such a huge game that I feel like we're probably missing some fairly large areas.
Oh, yeah,
and maybe
definitely.
We'll have to revisit this game again, one of the few.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
Maybe after you DM a game.
Yeah. I have ADD out my ears, so that'd be interesting. I would probably just let everyone go wherever they wanted and just, like, roll die every once in a while.
I mean, that's basically all you do as a DM.
Fair enough. All right. So we both think this is the best game, period.
Yeah.
Yes, we can. So we were awesome. And when I say we, I mean you. As in we posted a poll for Tamagotchi, our episode a few weeks back.
Somebody actually requested it, and way more people responded than I was expecting.
So thank you for that, audience. We do love hearing from you, and we would love to hear from you about Dungeons and Dragons. Do you agree with us? What's your play style? Are you more of the tactical? Are you more of a improver? Are you super serious in your campaigns? Or how do you play? And we will be posting a poll, hopefully, on our social media platforms.
Yeah, I didn't post a poll for Cuphead. My bad. But, yeah, I also wanted to give a shout out to, we have a new Patreon supporter.
Whoop whoop.
So I'm pretty stoked about that.
Love you.
Really hoping that we can get back to recording these on a more regular basis. Do we know what we're doing next week?
No.
Not yet.
Mm-mm.
We haven't discussed it yet, so we'll do that after we're done recording.
Life happens, guys.
Yeah. But I guess this is where I wrap up the show, huh?
Mm-hmm. If you want to. Otherwise, you can just flippity-diptity and, like, dip out of here.
So, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you spent your time listening to us in your ear holes.
It really does, guys. We do appreciate it.
For sure. You can find our show over on community.extra-life.org. If you don't know what Extra Life is, it's a fantastic charity. It's part of Children's Miracle Network Hospitals. And basically, people come together across the United States and Canada to play games and raise money for sick and injured kids in hospitals all around North America. So it's really great. You can learn more over at extra-life.org. And while you're there, if you choose to sign up, you can actually choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital you want to support, and 100% of everything you raise goes directly to that hospital to help sick and injured kids. It's really fantastic. Highly recommend. And over on community.extra-life.org, you can find this podcast along with a bunch of other really cool and interesting articles about Extra Life and video games and tabletop. So check it out. We will be back next week on Monday with some game. We're not sure yet. But you can find this podcast over on iTunes, SoundCloud, I think Spotify. We should be on Spotify now. All the different podcasting apps. So check it. And it's Gucci. Oh, and if you really liked our show, please follow us on Twitter @BestGamesPeriod. We really appreciate it. Leave us a review on iTunes or upvote the episode on SoundCloud or all that stuff. It does really help when you guys do that, so please do. And to top it off, if you really, really enjoyed the show, please consider backing us on Patreon for $1 or more every month, because that does actually help us to do more things. One of the things we were just talking about wanting to be able to do before the show went live is fund a trip for the two of us to go to events like PAX West, which is coming up here in a couple weeks. And that would be really cool, doing some Best Games Period from PAX West. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe we could get some Best Games Period stickers and like hand them out like awards.
Whoop. I would love to do that.
People love those at like E3.
I love stickers.
And people who make games even love getting stickers that say that their game was one of the best games period. So just gonna say. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Flippity Dippity.